morning, it's December 17th, and this is To My Liberal Friends. Well, Democrats are still trying to figure out what went wrong and where they should go in the future with their policies and messaging. And I can give them one piece of advice, but I suspect that the progressive wing of their party will reject it and urge them to press forward on this critical policy. And I'm talking about identity politics. In my opinion, this move to the left on using identity as the major defining characteristic started in the aftermath of the George Floyd death. It became the rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, and a large faction of white liberals and intellectuals decided among themselves that identity was the future of liberalism and the Democratic Party. Now, I will state right up front that most Americans believe that there is some form of racism and sexism that still exists in the nation, and it's a problem. But the progressives in the Democratic Party decided that equity would trump equality, and that's where they lost most Americans. Under a policy of equity, certain groups that are designated as disadvantaged will be given preference in things like hiring and college admissions and the like. To give an example, in a race, a person designated as being disadvantaged will be given a 10 to 15 yard head start in a 100-yard race. In the minds of these liberals, that would even out the field. Unfortunately, it would not determine who was really the fastest in the race and who would win. Under a policy of equality, everyone starts at the same point, and the winner is declared when they finish first. Now, one of the major problems with this policy of identity politics is it creates problems for both the person selected and the person who lost out. When I was a young boy, there was a growing movement to have colleges and universities adopt some form of quotas to ensure that minority students could be admitted. My doctor at that time was a black man, and he had attended Ohio State both as an undergraduate and in med school. He strenuously objected to establishing quotas because it made it appear that he was not as qualified as some white doctor. And according to him, he got there because of his qualifications, not the color of his skin. It's becoming apparent to most that the public's rejecting this idea of equity. In 2019, the Pew Research Center asked if employers should consider an applicant's race and ethnicity in hiring and promotions, or consider their qualifications exclusively, even if it resulted in less diversity. 74% of respondents favor considering qualifications alone. Majorities of white, black, Hispanic, and even Democratic Party respondents all agreed on that conclusion. And you would have thought that some Democrats would pay attention to this kind of data, but instead they ignored it at their own peril. Instead, they pushed forward believing that eventually the public would acknowledge that they were right. What you have is a big city Democratic mayor, Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, announcing that she would not grant interviews to white journalists. A first-time homebuyer program in Washington State, excluding applicants on the basis of race. Guidelines for access to COVID-19 treatments in New York that included race as a consideration. Faculty search committees where the race of applicants is openly and unlawfully discussed as a factor in hiring. Progressive activists organizing a day where they tell white people to absent themselves from a public university campus. A large medical institution penalizing a doctor of Filipino descent for, quote, internalized whiteness after she objected to racially segregated care. Subjecting a professor at a state university in Pennsylvania to a racially hostile climate in training sessions. And this list would go on, but I think you get the point. There are still some Democrats that don't want to face the music. The majority of them come from urban districts that are deep blue, so they don't have to worry about losing an election. Jasmine Crockett, Democrat from Texas, in the Dallas area, is a classic example. Her district is 40% black and 36% Hispanic. She won this seat this year with 74%. But that did not stop her from blasting Hispanics who did not vote for Harris. To her, they should have voted for the Democrat because they are a minority. In her statement, and I quote, "It almost reminds me of what people would talk about when they would talk about kind of slave mentality and the hate that some slaves would have for themselves. It's almost like a slave mentality that they have. It's wild to me when I hear how anti-immigrant they are as immigrants, many of them. I'm talking about people who literally just got here and can barely vote and are having this kind of attitude," end quote. To politicians like Crockett, race is the only factor that should be considered when voting, and identity politics is the way for the Democratic Party to continue. As I said, she can say this because, as I mentioned, she comes from a minority-drawn district and doesn't have to fear any real challenge. So as corporations back away from using diversity, equity, inclusion, and getting rid of the people within their ranks that enforce it, there will come a time when even the most hardcore Democrats will have to face the fact that the public, and I mean the public of all race and gender, are not buying it. One of the major problems with DEI and identity politics is those pushing it have no respect, zero, for individualism and will not tolerate any viewpoint diversity. It's all about the color of skin or gender to them. And if you don't fall in line and adhere to their orthodoxy, then you will be on the attack and you will have to be terminated or simply shunned. That in a nutshell is the problem and the failure of identity politics. It fails to reward talent and merit, and in the end lowers the bar for everyone and tamps down innovation and creativity. That's not how this country was built. That's not how we are as a nation. We are all equal. It's been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.